Few inventions have changed the world as much as gunpowder. For most of human history, warfare was defined by men fighting in hand-to-hand combat. There were some ranged weapons, such as the crossbow, the sling, or the bow and arrow, but normally they played a supportive role to men fighting with swords and spears. Gunpowder changed all that. It made obsolete military equipment that had existed for millennia, such as armor, the shield, or the catapult. It was one of the biggest reasons why the Europeans found it so easy to conquer the New World, often with only a few thousand men. So how was gunpowder discovered? Many people know that it was developed in China, but how did it spread all over the world? In this video, I'm going to answer all those questions. But first, we need to ask what might be the most important question of all. What exactly is gunpowder? To understand the artificial fire of gunpowder, we first need to understand normal fire, like that of a candle. Fire requires three things: fuel, oxygen, and heat. The heat breaks apart molecules in the fuel, allowing them to react with the oxygen. That reaction generates more heat, which breaks apart more molecules, which can then react with more oxygen. That creates a chain reaction that continues until the fire runs out of either fuel or oxygen. However, that doesn't explain everything. Most importantly, it doesn't explain how fast the reaction will occur. Some things burn very fast, for example, natural gas. Other things burn slowly, for example, a candle. What is it that determines how fast something will burn? The key factor is in fact how quickly oxygen can enter the reaction. A normal flame, like a candle, draws oxygen in from the air around it, which limits how fast it can burn. That then begs the question, what if there were a substance that released oxygen as it burned? Then there would be no need for oxygen from the air. Without that limitation, the fire could burn almost instantaneously and all the energy would be released at once. Such a substance doesn't exist naturally, but it can be made easily by combining common materials that do. As fuel, we can use sulfur and charcoal, both of which are easily available. To supply oxygen, we add probably the most important ingredient, saltpeter, which can be found in caves. Saltpeter is potassium nitrate, which gives off oxygen as it burns. Mixing those ingredients in the right proportions creates a substance that burns instantly, gunpowder. So how did humans develop gunpowder? When was this astonishing substance developed? Unfortunately, it's impossible to pinpoint exactly when or who first made gunpowder, but we do know that it developed in China as a result of their experiments with alchemy. Alchemy has existed in some form in many different civilizations. Humans were always fascinated by materials that had unique properties. Gold, the metal that never tarnished, mercury, the liquid metal, and sulfur, the stone that burned. However, the goal of the alchemists wasn't always the same. Alchemists in Europe were forever obsessing with how they could turn base metals into gold, but in China their fixation was how to become immortal, to create a potion for eternal life. The Chinese desire to create an elixir of life spanned centuries and actually killed many emperors. Many of the concoctions that they made contained toxic metals such as lead or mercury. Chinese emperors were poisoning themselves with those toxic cocktails as early as 210 BC and as late as 1735. For example, Emperor Xianzong of the Tang dynasty went mad from his ingestion of mercury, and eventually his erratic behavior led to him being assassinated by the court eunuchs. The Chinese were never able to create a potion for eternal life, but their experiments did lead them to another discovery. Ironically, in their pursuit of eternal life, they stumbled upon the recipe for gunpowder, a substance that would be used primarily to kill. We don't know exactly how the development happened, but we can be sure that it didn't happen overnight. The development of gunpowder was a gradual process, with alchemists slowly improving the recipe over time. The first experiments produced a substance that wasn't explosive, but it was extremely flammable. For example, one Chinese text from the mid-800s talks about a concoction of sulfur, saltpeter, honey, and a crystal known as realgar. The text comments that the mixture could be dangerous, resulting in a huge amount of smoke and flames. Some alchemists got severe burns, and it even led to house fires. That mixture wasn't true gunpowder, but it was getting close. The fact that it wasn't explosive meant that it wasn't possible for people to use it to make weapons like cannons or muskets. However, the powder did burn very fiercely, and so people began to experiment with it to make all sorts of incendiary weapons. One example was the fire arrow. Crude fire arrows had long been made by attaching flammable materials to the arrow's shaft. However, using gunpowder allowed for the creation of much more effective fire arrows that burned more intensely and for longer. Another early gunpowder weapon was the fire lance. It was essentially a normal lance, but a gunpowder packet was attached near the spear point to make something like a flamethrower. The gunpowder didn't add much to the weapon other than to gain a shock advantage at the start of a melee. Many of the early gunpowder weapons were pretty absurd, some of them even involved animals. One example was the Firebird, which was exactly what it sounds like. A bundle of gunpowder was attached to a bird, ignited, and then the bird was released and directed towards the enemy. Other animals were also turned into incendiary weapons, including oxen. Something that makes it difficult to say when exactly gunpowder weapons were first used in war is that it really depends on what counts as a gunpowder weapon. As you can see, a primitive form of gunpowder was used in incendiary weapons for a long time. For me though, to really count as a gunpowder weapon, there needs to be an explosion rather than just a fierce fire. Exactly when the first explosive weapons were used is impossible to say. There are Chinese texts from the 11th and 12th centuries that talk about various different weapons, but whether they were explosive or just incendiary isn't clear. The first truly detailed account of explosive gunpowder weapons being used was at the siege of Kaifeng in 1126. Kaifeng was the capital of the Song dynasty, which ruled over southern China. The city was under siege from an army of the Jin dynasty of northern China. Little did the Jin attackers know that they were about to encounter one of the first instances of explosive gunpowder weapons in history. As they approached the walls, Song soldiers appeared above, each holding what looked like a paper bundle. They hurled those bundles over the walls towards the Jin warriors below. As they hit the ground, there was a deafening boom and the earth shook. The sound plunged the attacking soldiers into chaos, breaking their formation. What the Song warriors were using was a new weapon that they had been developing, which they called the thunderclap bomb. They were made from a bamboo or paper casing filled with gunpowder and were some of the first weapons in history to be truly explosive. From the walls of Kaifeng, Song soldiers hurled those thunderclap bombs at the Jin, inducing panic in the attackers. According to witnesses, many fled, howling with fright. Despite that, in the end, the defenders weren't actually able to hold off the siege, and the city fell to the Jin. Now, as far as we know, the thunderclap bombs used at the siege of Kaifeng weren't actually powerful enough to kill you. They were probably only able to shock and startle the enemy, but lacked the explosive impact to be truly deadly. Bombs that could kill from the strength of their explosion would arrive just a few decades later, in the early 1200s. The main difference between them and the previous bomb was that they used a hard cast iron casing. That meant that the pressure from the burning gunpowder would build up until it was enough to break the cast iron, leading to a much greater shockwave. They were black spheres with a fuse sticking out and looked a lot like the bomb icon that we are so familiar with from video games. One of the first accounts of the use of those bombs is during the siege of Qizhou in 1221, another battle between the Song and Jin dynasties. The Song were defending Qizhou against the Jin attackers, and they had thousands of different gunpowder weapons, including the thunderclap bombs that I mentioned before. However, the Jin had developed their new cast iron bombs, and they were going to prove devastatingly effective. They catapulted the bombs over the city walls, and they wreaked havoc in the city. According to the Song commander, his men had their heads, their eyes, their cheeks blown to bits. The commander was actually able to get his hands on one of the bombs and examine it. He said, "They are made with pig iron, about 2 inches thick, and they cause the city's walls to shake." The bombs would prove decisive in the siege, and after weeks of bombardment, the Jin forces took the city. That said, it's important to remember that those bombs still had big problems and were very unreliable. They often detonated prematurely or failed to detonate entirely. By the mid-1250s, gunpowder was a standard part of warfare in China, but the question remains, how did it get to Europe? Unfortunately, we don't really know exactly how gunpowder made it to Europe, and we probably never will. Historians have different opinions on how it happened, but one of the main theories is that it was brought by the Mongols. The Mongol era started in 1206, when a man named Temujin was crowned Genghis Khan, or Supreme King of Mongolia. He had spent the first 40 years of his life uniting the various Mongol tribes, and now under his leadership the Mongols would embark on an astonishing conquest. Over the next few decades, the Mongols would create the largest land empire in history and kill tens of millions of people in the process. The Mongols did know about gunpowder, but it wasn't a key part of how they waged war, likely because they didn't have the raw materials to produce it. Instead, they built their empire on their incredible mastery of horsemanship. Mongol men grew up around horses, which meant that by adulthood they were able to maneuver without using reins, shooting arrows accurately, even at full gallop. The Mongol military was almost entirely centered around cavalry. There were 5 horses per man, which allowed for a mobility incomparable with any other army at the time. The Mongols likely first came across gunpowder during their conquest of China in the east. Initially, they had gunpowder weapons used against them. For example, in 1232, the Mongols laid siege to the Jin capital Kaifeng. The Jin defenders used the cast iron bombs that I mentioned earlier with devastating effect. When the Mongol attackers were close to the walls, the defenders lowered a bomb on a chain. According to one chronicler, the attacking soldiers were all blown to bits, not even a trace was left behind. Despite that, the Mongols did eventually take the city and were able to conquer the entire Jin dynasty in 1234. Throughout the 1200s, the Mongols continued their conquest and built an enormous empire that spanned from China in the east to Europe in the west. It is possible that it was those conquests that spread gunpowder across the world. The timeline does seem to match up. For example, the first gunpowder formulas appeared in the Middle East around 1260, just when the Mongols were arriving. The first mention of gunpowder in Western Europe was in 1267 in the writing of English philosopher Roger Bacon. Bacon wrote about a child's toy of sound and fire made with powder of saltpeter, sulphur and charcoal of hazelwood. He described its effect saying, "By the flash and combustion of fires and by the horror of the sounds, wonders can be wrought." The fact that the first mention of gunpowder in Europe was by a man in England, in the far west of Europe, shows us how little record there is of the transfer of gunpowder from east to west. Early evidence of gunpowder is pretty much non-existent in the regions between China and Europe. In fact, there are actually some historians that believe that gunpowder might have been discovered independently in Europe, although that is definitely not the mainstream opinion. There are a few key things that make most historians believe that gunpowder did indeed come from China. First is the fact that we have records of Chinese gunpowder formulas going back to 1044, while the first mention in Europe is in 1267, about 2 centuries later. Another key point is that we have records of all the experimentation that the Chinese did, gradually refining the gunpowder formula. We can see how they got better at making gunpowder over time. That slow progression towards potent gunpowder contrasts sharply with Europe, where gunpowder appeared very suddenly in the historical records. In Europe, it was less than a century from the first mention of gunpowder to its use in cannons, suggesting that they adopted a mature technology from China without the need for extensive experimentation. A final interesting point is that early gunpowder recipes included additives like sal ammoniac and arsenic, which didn't actually enhance the gunpowder's effectiveness. Those same ineffective ingredients are also found in Chinese formulas, and it seems quite unlikely that it would be pure coincidence that both places were adding them. Another interesting point is that the early gunpowder recipes from the Middle East often made reference to China. For example, saltpeter was referred to as Chinese snow. Fire arrows were referred to as Chinese arrows. The Arabic and Persian word for gunpowder was fire drug, which is also what the Chinese were calling it. Ultimately, we just don't have as much evidence as we need to be sure of how gunpowder got to Europe, but we do know that it arrived by the mid-1200s. So when was gunpowder first used in weapons in Europe? Well, the first depiction of something like a cannon is from 1326 in a manuscript by an English scholar. The picture shows a man igniting a fuse, firing something that looks like a large arrow. Unfortunately, it's not possible to know when gunpowder weapons were first used in battle. According to one historian, it might have been at the siege of Cividale in 1331, but that isn't a consensus viewpoint. The first time that we can be sure that gunpowder weapons were used in warfare is during the 100 Years' War between England and France. That enormous conflict happened because the kings of England believed that they had a claim to the French throne. In 1346, the two sides met near the town of Crécy in northern France. The battle was a major gamble for the English. Both their king and his son were present on the battlefield, which meant that a defeat could lead to the capture or death of both of them. For the French, victory could have meant the eradication of an entire English dynasty in one decisive battle. Add to that the fact that the English army was heavily outnumbered. The exact figures are uncertain, but they probably had around 4,000 knights, 7,000 archers and 5,000 spearmen. The French, on the other hand, had up to 80,000 men and some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. However, the English had an ace up their sleeves: 5 primitive cannons. They were very basic, small bronze or iron tubes strapped to wooden frames. They might actually have been rebaldekins, where multiple cannons were arranged on a cart and would fire a salvo. Those were sometimes called organ guns because their multiple barrels, arranged side by side, resembled the pipes of an organ. The cannons were very tricky to use correctly and so could only be handled by experts. In truth, testing those experimental and unpredictable weapons when the stakes were so high probably wasn't wise. For the English soldiers, the adoption of that new weapon likely wouldn't have been particularly welcome. Soldiers often hated new things, and gunpowder was associated with the mysterious work of alchemists, so it probably seemed dangerous, unreliable, and maybe even unlucky. Add to that the fact that fighting from a distance wasn't respected. Aristocratic warriors thought archers were cowards for attacking from afar instead of engaging in honourable hand-to-hand combat. In the end, the English did win the Battle of Crécy, but the cannons didn't play a major role in the victory. The new weapons did manage to knock a few Frenchmen off their horses, but not inflict any real damage. That was because gunpowder was still weak, and the cannons themselves were unreliable and inefficient. Their accuracy was poor, and reloading them was a slow and cumbersome process. That said, they probably did have a psychological effect on the French, as the majority of their troops would never have seen anything like them. The first way that gunpowder weapons changed warfare in a big way was in sieges. During the Middle Ages, stone castles and city walls were nearly invincible, often forcing attacking armies into costly and prolonged sieges to starve out defenders. With enough supplies, defenders could hold on for months, often outlasting the attackers. The strength of a castle lay in its tall, thick walls, which could resist almost all weapons, including catapults. Gunpowder weapons were going to change that, but it didn't happen immediately. It would take time. The earliest cannons weren't actually powerful enough to break through stone. For example, after his victory at the Battle of Crécy, King Edward of England did try using his cannons in a siege at Calais, but they proved ineffective. His gunpowder was too weak, and the cannonballs were too small and slow to break through the French city's walls. Nevertheless, it was clear that if cannons could be made more powerful, they would be a game-changer in siege warfare. Recognizing that, gunners, powder makers, and metallurgists began to innovate. They developed new techniques for working with metal, and guns rapidly increased in size and power. They soon developed enormous cannons known as bombards, which would become the first truly effective gunpowder weapon. Bombards would fire absolutely enormous cannonballs, sometimes over 100 kilograms. Stone walls couldn't withstand the impact, which allowed the attackers to create a breach and then rush in. Bombards were very effective and quickly spread all over Europe. For example, less than a decade after cannons were first used at the Battle of Crécy, Italian poet Petrarch observed, "These instruments, which discharge balls of metal with a most tremendous noise, were, a few years ago, very rare, and were viewed with great astonishment and admiration, but now they are as common and familiar as any other kind of arms. So quick and ingenious are the minds of men in learning the most pernicious of arts." Bombards were a terrifying weapon. When they were used to attack a city, its inhabitants would have to endure the thunderous boom of the explosions, followed by the impact of heavy stone balls that made the ground tremble. By the early 1400s, guns had transformed from curiosities into indispensable tools of warfare. No commander would dream of embarking on a campaign without them. For example, in 1415, the English laid siege to Harfleur in the north of France and would use the new weapons with devastating effect. 12 great cannons bombarded the city with 400-pound stones, terrifying the inhabitants. The cannons were decisive, making the siege one of the first times in European history that gunpowder weapons would play such an important role in a battle. From afar, the English destroyed the town's walls, and so, seeing that their situation was hopeless, the French surrendered in only 5 weeks. Eventually, the French themselves would also master the use of cannons and would use them to turn the tide of the 100 Years' War against the English. For example, in 1449, the French army laid siege to Rouen and used their own cannons to bombard the city. The inhabitants surrendered after only 3 days. 2 months later, French cannons battered Harfleur into submission, reclaiming it from the English. Those rapid outcomes in battles highlight how artillery was transforming siege warfare, making victories quicker than ever before. The end of the 100 Years' War eventually came when the English were under siege at Castillon in 1453. An English army moved to lift the siege, but the French obliterated the relief force with their cannons. According to one witness, the artillery caused serious damage to the English, each shot taking down 5 or 6 men, killing them instantly. The English leader himself was killed by the cannon fire, and the French were able to take the city. With Castillon's surrender, the dynastic war that had troubled Europe for more than 100 years finally ended. That same year, gunpowder weapons would play a major role in another important battle on the other side of Europe, the siege of Constantinople. For centuries, Constantinople had been the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, also called the Byzantine Empire. However, by the 1400s, the Byzantine Empire was very weak and had lost almost all of its former territories to the Ottomans. Eventually, all that remained of that once great empire was Constantinople, the historic capital. However, for the Ottomans to take Constantinople was not going to be easy. The city had survived 20 sieges over the centuries thanks to its huge double walls and strategic seaside position. In 1422, the Ottomans had tried using a cannon to destroy the walls, but it hadn't been powerful enough, and so they'd been forced to withdraw. Luckily for them, they had one of the most skilled metallurgists of the age working for them, a Hungarian named Urban. Urban had initially offered his services to the Byzantine emperor, but the salary on offer didn't meet his expectations. Urban then approached the Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II, who was willing to reward him handsomely if he could create a gun to break down Constantinople's walls. By January of 1453, Urban had cast a bombard of monstrous proportions, a 26-foot-long barrel capable of firing a stone ball weighing over half a ton. In fact, the gun was so big that when testing it, they had to give a day's notice to nearby civilians to stop them from panicking. The massive cannon worked well, and so it was sent to destroy the walls of Constantinople. The bombardment would have been an astonishing sight, with huge stone balls crashing into the walls, shaking them and crushing stone against stone. The relentless pounding eventually broke down the outer wall, allowing the Turks to move their guns closer and fire directly into Constantinople. Eventually the Turks were able to open one of the gates and storm the city. The importance of gunpowder in the battle can't be overstated. The Ottomans had fired over 5,000 cannonballs and used about 25 tons of gunpowder. As for Urban, the Hungarian who had made the enormous bombard, he was never able to enjoy the rewards of his work. It's believed that he lost his life when one of his own creations blew up during the siege. As we can see, gunpowder weapons were still extremely unpredictable and accident-prone. So far, I've talked almost entirely about cannons, but of course, the most important gunpowder weapon of all time was the handheld gun. So how did that develop? Well, the first handguns in Europe were essentially small cannons, and they appeared in the 1300s. The defining feature of a hand cannon was that it didn't have any kind of trigger mechanism. To fire it, the soldier would need to directly ignite the gunpowder with a lit fuse. At the back was a stick called a tiller, which went under the man's arm, allowing him to aim. As you can imagine, they were extremely cumbersome, unreliable, and slow to load. Unfortunately, there isn't much evidence about the use of hand cannons in battle. That lack of records is likely because they never really played a decisive role on the battlefield. They were probably present at the Battle of Crécy and the Siege of Calais in 1346, but it's impossible to know whether they made much of a difference. A lot of what we know about hand cannons is from examining the few that survive. For example, one hand cannon was found in Loschult, Sweden, and is the oldest European firearm ever found, dating back to the 1300s. It's small, just 9 kilograms in weight and 30 centimeters long. Historians have actually made a replica of it and tested its ability as a gun. They found that it performed surprisingly well and was able to penetrate medieval plate armor much better than arrows from longbows. It was also more accurate than expected, able to hit a stationary target 200 meters away. Another find is the Tannenberg gun, which dates back to about 1400. It was discovered in the water well of a destroyed castle, and unfortunately the wooden part of it decayed once exposed to the air. Those early handguns were not very effective and probably never played a key role in any major battle. In order for them to become effective, 2 key developments would need to happen. The first was an improvement in gunpowder itself. Initially, people were using a form of gunpowder known as serpentine powder, which was a very fine mix of saltpeter, charcoal and sulfur. Serpentine powder had a few problems, such as the fact that it absorbed moisture easily and didn't always burn well. Over time, people realized that the gunpowder functioned better when it was pressed into grains, so-called corned powder. Corned powder was more resistant to moisture and burned more reliably. It allowed gun makers to produce longer and narrower barrels, allowing them to shoot smaller projectiles at higher speeds. The other key development that allowed for the creation of effective handguns was the invention of a trigger mechanism to ignite the gunpowder. As I mentioned earlier, hand cannons had to be ignited by the soldier touching the gunpowder directly with a lit fuse, which was very slow and cumbersome. What handguns needed was something faster and more reliable. The first attempt at that was the matchlock, where the soldier pulled a trigger and a slow-burning match was put into contact with the gunpowder. That system had some obvious issues. For instance, the match had to be removed from the gun during reloading so that it didn't set off the gunpowder. There was also the risk that the match would go out, and so both ends were kept alight. That said, the matchlock did allow for the development of the first revolvers, where multiple chambers could be loaded before use, meaning that the man would have several shots before needing to reload. The next major development in trigger mechanisms came around 1500, and it was called the wheel lock. The wheel lock used a friction mechanism to create sparks to then ignite the gunpowder. It was the first self-igniting firearm. As you can imagine, it was a huge advantage not having to keep hold of a lit match during reloading. That said, the wheel lock still had some problems. It was a very complex, intricate mechanism which made it prone to failure. It required precision engineering, which meant that it was expensive to make, so only the richest could afford it. Despite their limitations, the matchlock and the wheel lock allowed for firearms to become much more prevalent on the battlefield. In the late 1400s, gunners were still greatly outnumbered by bowmen, swordsmen and pikemen, but their numbers were steadily increasing. Unfortunately, we can't know when exactly handheld gunpowder weapons were first decisive in a battle. One of the first battles that we know about in detail where they did play a decisive role is the Battle of Cerignola in 1503. That was part of the Italian Wars, a very complicated series of conflicts in the early 1500s. The Battle of Cerignola saw Spain and France fight it out over domination of the Kingdom of Naples. The Spanish had about 6,000 men, including 2,000 German mercenary pikemen. They also had about 1,000 men armed with an early handheld gunpowder weapon, the arquebus. These were relatively light firearms with a small caliber, only about 1 to 2 centimeters. The trigger mechanism was the matchlock that I mentioned earlier, where the gunpowder would be ignited directly with a slow-burning match. The Spanish were outnumbered, but they actually had an advantage from the terrain. There was a road which had sunk into the earth, creating a natural defensive trench. The Spanish commander decided to base his whole battle plan around that trench. He ordered that sharp stakes be embedded on the raised ground above the road. In the trench itself, he stationed his 1,000 arquebusiers. As the French army approached, they had failed to take notice of the sunken road. Overconfident because of their superior numbers, they advanced incautiously and were met with devastating volleys of arquebus fire and cut down before they could reach the Spanish troops. In the end, the French lost about 4,000 men, while the Spanish lost only 1/10 as many. The day had been won due to the arquebus, making it one of the first battles in history where handheld gunpowder weapons were so important. In the words of one Spanish commander, they had won by a little ditch, a parapet of earth, and the arquebus. Over the next few decades, gunpowder weapons came to dominate the battlefields of Europe, going from uncommon specialty weapons to the primary way that battles were fought. By the late 1500s, firearms had become a core component of European armies, making up about 40% of infantry forces. It's important to note that for a long time, a man with a firearm wasn't actually more valuable on the battlefield than a well-trained archer. The firearm was more powerful and so better able to pierce armor, but on the other hand, the archer had a much greater rate of fire and was more accurate. The real advantage of firearms was that they were so much easier to use. It took just a few weeks to train a man to use an arquebus, while it took years of dedicated practice to become a proficient archer. A Chinese military manual from 1644 summed it up well. The bow and arrow are only able to hit the mark and kill the enemy if one has both skill and strength. The gun contains skill and strength itself, completely independent of the person. Over time, firearms continued to get better. For example, another important innovation came in the early 1600s, a new trigger mechanism called the flintlock. Throughout the 1500s, all handheld firearms were either matchlock or wheel-lock, both of which had significant disadvantages. The flintlock, like the wheel-lock, was a self-igniting mechanism, which meant that the soldier didn't need to carry around a lit fuse. However, it was much simpler than the wheel-lock, which meant that it was more reliable and easier to maintain. It was also cheaper, which meant that it could be the standard trigger mechanism of a military, rather than something that could only be afforded by the rich. By the late 17th century and throughout the 18th century, flintlock muskets became the norm, offering greater reliability and faster firing than their predecessors. At that point, gunpowder weapons had reached something of an optimum, and they didn't change a great deal until the 1800s. Europe and the world's adoption of gunpowder weapons was complete. As I was making this video, the thing that I really took away from it was that the development of gunpowder was a very slow, gradual process. There was no one day when someone invented gunpowder for the first time. You could argue that gunpowder hadn't truly been created until the development of corn powder in the early 1400s. If that is the case, then it was potentially almost a millennium from the first Chinese experiments making a flammable powder to the perfection of the black powder that would go on to drive the gunpowder age and the conquest of the world.